Welcome to the second episode of Missions Matter by Disco, a show about building and scaling culture in the age of digital transformation. I'm Jeremy Vandehey, co-founder of Disco. Disco is an app that helps companies celebrate, reinforce, and measure their values inside of tools employees use. So things like Slack, Microsoft Teams, Google Hangouts. And we help our customers create values-driven orgs, which lead to happier, more productive people. I'm excited to chat with Judith Michelle Williams, and Judith's the head of People Sustainability and the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at SAP. She's here to chat with us about the impact of diverse teams, how the future of work will enable more inclusive teams, which lead to better products, and how you can start building a stronger team, whether you're a young startup like Disco or a public company like SAP.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And I actually feel like I need to apologize because I kind of lured you here under false pretenses, not with malicious intent, but the original show was called Culture Karaoke. We've since changed that to Missions Matter. But I do feel a deep desire to still ask you karaoke questions because you actually talked about bringing your karaoke microphone here. So
I did.
Can I just hear a little bit more about your passion? What is Judith's karaoke favorite song? How did she get so into it?
One of my colleagues loved karaoke, so we started going on Fridays at a place called Encore Karaoke, which is on Polk in California, if anyone is interested, and in San Francisco. It's a fun karaoke bar, and we just started going, and so any opportunity now, and I am not a great singer, but I am an enthusiastic singer.
I think that's all it takes.
That and some alcohol.
And this is one with like a private room, right?
So no, this is one where it's just all out for everybody to see. The private room, that's for cowards.
That's for beginners.
It's karaoke.
Yeah. Nobody's out there to be professional.
I mean, some people are, but most people are out there to have fun. I am currently the Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer for SAP. I actually started at SAP in September, so I'm not long in role. Prior to that, I was working as an independent consultant, and one of the fun projects I was able to work on was the Reframe project, which is a collaboration with Women and Film and the Sundance Institute, and the focus is on increased gender balance in film, TV, and digital media, both from the sense of the production staff, but also the stories that are told. And so I help them develop their culture change roadmap and also their curriculum for culture change. Prior to that, I led diversity and inclusion at Dropbox. And prior to that, I was a diversity program manager at Google, where I led the unconscious bias program.
I'm curious how you approached your job in terms of building a more inclusive environment and inclusive workforce. The needs or the stages of a company like Dropbox, a company like Google, and a company like SAP are different in some senses, or if that wasn't even really a consideration.
Well, the scope of the challenge changes, and sometimes the problems that you have do change depending on the size or the stage of the company. But for me, the process always begins with the data. And so I like to understand, well, what's going on in terms of demographics, in terms of the hiring process, in terms of promotion rates or time to promotion, time in role. And once you look at that sort of data, you can get a sense of, well, where are your gaps? You certainly can see what's happening at each level. In a smaller organization, certainly you're going to have fewer levels, but what you will have are key roles. And so you can see if, for example, the most junior people tend to be one particular demographic compared to the most senior people. You're beginning to have some differences in terms of your inclusion. So I would say always start with the data and collect data early. And sometimes we also want data on our decisions. A lot of times we think about all of our decisions as individual decisions, but if you start tracking the decisions that you make, you may find that each one of those individual decisions is actually leading up to a pattern, and that pattern can be indicative of a certain type of bias. So, for example, I may have a very strong preference for the people that I went to college with. I socialize with them. I tell lots of stories about someone I meet who's gone to that college that might not be true, but that's a like me bias, and that's a preference. And so I have to think about that if I'm hiring someone and I meet someone who went to that college, or if I'm using that as a key filter. And so sometimes we naturally gravitate to things like that. We can track our individual behavior, But we can also track our organization's behavior regardless of the size. Now, certainly you need a better tool to collect that data when you get to the size of a Dropbox or a Google, but even small organizations can start looking at the patterns in their decision making.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was thinking about when I was preparing for this show is like Disco is a tool that, basically helps kind of shape these micro interactions through positive reinforcement, essentially tying it to a company's values. And a lot of companies will have like an explicit value that says like, we care about diversity and inclusion. And one thing that I really like, and I guess this is jumping forward to SAP, is I think it was embrace differences is the value, which to me is actionable and approachable, and that like I can actually see how that ties into decisions throughout my day versus like just a broader thing that's a little less actionable. So I think you all are already doing a good job with how you think about that.
Well, if we think about what makes a successful organization or a successful team, it's not that you have one really smart person. It's that you have groups of people that have different backgrounds, experiences, different skills, and they're able to successfully collaborate and work together. And so if you embrace difference, you're actually embracing what you hired people for, you're embracing what is possible, and you have a spirit of openness. And I believe that leads to greater innovation. I think it is really important to acknowledge that we all have biases. There's shortcuts in the way that we process information. I was interviewing for SAP, and my interview was over. And so it had been a very intense couple days. And I was waiting for my driver to take me from Heidelberg, where I was staying, to the Frankfurt airport, which is about 45 minutes away. And I was incredibly concerned about missing my plane. I'd had a really stressful day, and I didn't see my driver. And I was getting increasingly frustrated. So I called the recruiter and I said, hey, the driver's not here. And the recruiter called the dispatcher, and the dispatcher said, the driver is there. And we went back and forth for a while. And then finally I was on the phone with the dispatcher, and the dispatcher had me on one end and had the driver on the other end. And I looked across and I saw a woman, and I locked eyes with her, and I realized that my unconscious bias was such that when I thought driver, I thought man. And so I couldn't see her. And if you think about what triggers our unconscious biases, it's when we're stressed, it's when the stakes are really high, it's when we don't have enough information, we have limited information. So we fill in the blanks.
Which is a typical work environment, right?
It's
like
a typical work environment. Exactly. Especially at a startup, right?
Yeah.
So it's very easy. And you would think with all of these organizations doing unconscious bias training that being aware would help you. But I've trained thousands of people on unconscious bias. And in that moment when I was completely stressed out and worried, I still fell into a very typical bias. And she fell into a bias as well because she wasn't expecting to see someone who looked like me.
I find that when you're talking about, especially as somebody who looks like me, as like a Caucasian male who's, in his early 30s, it can be uncomfortable. Nobody wants to say I'm biased or I'm making decisions that are like harmful to not just our organization, but people who want to join or like want to use the product or things like that. It's such a humanizing experience to understand that like everybody has these things. I think the first step is just acknowledging that. I tend to assume like everybody has very good intent, but like let's just acknowledge that, and then we can actually move past it to the next step to driving actual change in terms of building a team that is very inclusive.
As human beings, we have a lot of information that comes to us at every moment. And if we had to process it consciously, we wouldn't be able to function. We wouldn't be able to make our day-to-day decisions. The challenge is that sometimes those biases affect our decisions about people. I mean, they can actually affect our decisions about all sorts of things. But we do want to be sensitive to the fact that we have them. Awareness is the first step, but even awareness isn't enough to counteract them. We need to be looking at our own behavior. We need to give ourselves more time. A lot of times people say, well, I'm really rushed. It's like we always have 30 more seconds to take a step and say, wait a minute, might this be one of my biases firing? Can you think about it? Another way is to ask someone about it, because oftentimes people have different sets of blind spots. So getting more inputs, that can help. And it's a parallel processing error for us. While our biases are firing, we are unable to correct for them because we as human beings can't parallel process. But if you have another person, that helps you. And I think it's important that we think about the shared accountability. And if you're building a culture, you want a feedback culture where people feel really comfortable saying, hey, Jeremy, I noticed this, and I just want to give you the opportunity to correct it, right? And it's what you say, assume good intent. And we assume good intent until proven otherwise.
When these unconscious biases come out or in these, stressful, intense situations, which for any of our listeners who have, we're all, probably working at a company that has been in a stressful situation, but starting one for me personally has been like the most fulfilling, but also the most insanely stressful experience of my life so far. I don't have any kids yet. So like, how do you typically like coach or work with people who are on the earlier side and need to think about this stuff from day one? 'Cause something I find is like my brother is my co-founder, and like genetically speaking, he's the least diverse person for me that I could possibly work with. But I think it speaks to a broader theme of like we kind of manifest our own network, and pushing against that from the get go, and there's pressures pushing into it as well as like you want to grow quickly, you want to like fill roles, and there's all of these reasons to just kind of kick cans down the road, So I'd just be curious how you think about that, how you work with smaller teams.
Well, I always coach folks to say, when you're smaller, it's easier. So if you think about SAP, we have about 95,000 employees currently, and
It's crazy.
changing a ship like that
Yeah.
is really challenging. If you think about just from the numbers that you need to hire to really make a difference in terms of our percentages for demographics.
Is there a newer, better metaphor for a company that's 95,000 people instead of like the Titanic? Because I feel like the
I hope it's not the Titanic, right? That's not a good metaphor. That's a good question.
Like
not
a
the
Caribbean
Titanic,
cruise boat or something?
Not the Lusitania. And the problem with the Caribbean cruise boats, sometimes they get norovirus, so I'm not really comfortable with that one either.
Okay. Let's think about that throughout the course of the show. And
Yeah,
we'll try and find one.
Well, think about that. It's a smaller number that you need to, and what happens is that there's a network effect. And so if you can build diversity in early, when you have, let's say, a handful of people or 10 people, then you hire one or two people who will have very different networks. You tap into their networks, and it becomes a virtuous circle to always be aware of it. And it also changes your culture, because you're thinking about inclusion. You're bringing in people with different backgrounds from the beginning, and they'll get that input. They'll have that voice. And when I talk to startup founders, I say, look, you're small now, but you're not going into this because you want to stay small. So you want to think about what's the culture that you want to build, what are the values that you have, and how can you make sure that your early decisions reflect that culture and those values. And if you do that, then it's a lot easier to grow on top of those values. It changes, I think, also what your opportunities are, because you may not see things that someone with a very different background can see. And so you may find new opportunities. Most startups have to pivot at some point. And so having different people in the room, I think, helps you think through that pivot in a different way.
Yeah. And just from our own personal experience, like we've been thoughtful about finding people who, didn't also share a mother and a father, and
it's probably a limited number.
Yeah, it's a set of 4, and our 2 other siblings would never want to work with us anyways. They know better. But some of our biggest insights came from people who don't look like me. So I think even in a sample size of 6, we're already seeing just the crazy high business returns, let alone just the satisfaction of not having the same conversations day in and day out. Because regardless of size, it's like that next idea could be the thing that propels you forward, and that can really come from anywhere. And it's something we think a lot about is like the world's only getting more connected. So your products need to be able to scale, especially at a company like SAP, to people who, come from different places, who live in different cultures, who speak different languages. So it's really easy for me now to see how all of this is just laying a foundation for a more successful future. Related to like the different phases of a company, how do you think about like measuring the results of your work? Because you talked a little bit about going back to the data. Mm-hmm. Are there goals or benchmarks that you look towards that big companies can also start to kind of align themselves against, small companies can kind of shoot for? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I like to think about what are the outcomes that we're trying to drive. And so if we are thinking about increasing the number of women in leadership, we need to have a target. So at SAP, we have a goal to have 30% women in leadership by 2020. We've been really public about that goal. We've been really vocal about it internally. That allows us to mobilize all of our activity toward changing that demographic, changing that number. And so we're able to then say, well, what are the interventions that we're using? What is the impact that they have? I'm also a big fan of piloting and validating. So if we have an idea for a program, let's start small. Let's work out the kinks. Let's get some data. Let's make sure that I come out of an academic background, so I like to think about, well, what's the experimental condition and how do we make sure that we can control for as many variables as possible so that we really do know that the intervention that we are piloting has the impact that we think. And so I think that the start small and scale is actually a really good model for a big company like SAP, because if you start really big and it's an intervention that's not validated and is not successful, the resources that it takes to do that are really large. So if you start small and you say, okay, let's validate, then you can scale up and you know before you invest the resources. And I think that's probably a great model for smaller companies as well.
Yeah, and I love the data-driven approach. I think there is so much data out there if you're just really clear on what you're driving towards and putting the tools in place to be able to measure that. It's just so much easier to kind of build momentum, I would imagine, as you're starting small, you knock a goal out of the park, and then you can just keep elevating that. One thing I'm curious about is a lot of times, or when I initially thought about like diversity and inclusion, I go right to like hiring and just making sure the team is diverse and you're bringing the right people in. I'm curious how you think about like the rest of the employee life cycle, and are there processes kind of built into fostering more inclusiveness, not just on, gender or race, but like thought diversity or any of those other attributes?
Well, when I think about diversity, I think that there are basically two big buckets of diversity. One is our inherent diversity. So those are the things that we're born with, things like geographic origin, our gender identity, our ethnicity or race. Those are things that we are born with, really, really hard to change, if not impossible. And then there are the things that we acquire, our acquired diversity. And that's what makes us different, makes you different from your brother, right? Because even though you've had the same parents and the same early experiences, you probably had different experience outside of the home. Probably your birth order changes that. So it's important that we create an environment where people feel psychologically safe to express their difference. So when we think about inclusion, Catalyst as an organization does a lot of research on diversity and inclusion. One thing is that their model says that inclusion is about uniqueness and belonging. So you want to feel that you are valued for your uniqueness, but you also want to feel a sense of belonging. So there are things you can do to communicate that there's a sense of belonging. Things like parental leave, so that both men and women are expected to take leave to care for their children. And that seems like a really basic thing, but for so long we've enshrined maternity leave, this idea that women leave and men stay. And that creates a certain career path. So we're not thinking about the fact that in our current situation, both parents may want to be part of a child's early life. So, and then thinking about, again, how do we make sure that parents have the support that they need? How do we think about people who may come back to the workforce after an absence because perhaps they've been caring for a child, perhaps they've had a long illness? How do we think about making sure we support that type of difference as well? At SAP, we have a program called Autism at Work, where we have actively tried to create a process that makes it possible for individuals on the spectrum to actually showcase their skills rather than their difference, right? To show what they can contribute. We've had a lot of success, and we've had to think about what's the process, what's the preparation, what's the manager support, what's the development life cycle.
One thing we found at Disco is just being able to build a fundamental basis of trust is like the most important thing. That's when you can start putting yourself out there and like really actually showing up at work as like how you want to portray yourself. And then this sense of belonging is incredibly important as well. And we think a lot about what do they share in common, and it's their connectedness to the culture and that they're buying into these values as like these are the operating mechanism. This is how we behave. This is how we make decisions. These are all things that we share has an incredible impact. I'm curious how technology and like the future of work kind of will impact that, because we see more and more teams who are communicating, are collaborating, and they're not face to face. So what does, building, because it opens up doors in terms of like you can hire all over the world. It's easier to connect. It's easier to collaborate. But it could also be more difficult to kind of manifest that level of trust, that level of belonging. How do you think about the role technology will play in terms of where this space in our industry is headed?
Technology has a lot of potential, and it can link us together, and we see that in some of our personal lives, but also at work. In terms of, I have a team that is completely disparate. So I have a number of folks in Europe, I have folks in Canada, I have folks on the East Coast, I have a team member in Bangalore. So we seldom are in the same room. And in fact, most of the time, we're all virtual. All my one-on-ones are virtual. Our team meetings are virtual. We have a yearly summit where we actually get together, and then there are other occasions when I might go work with some folks and not others. So we really have to think about how do you build connection. And one technology that I've used, it's called Dabra. And it's a really interesting AI. You answer a few questions, and it actually is able to give you insight on how people like to communicate, how people like to work. And it reminds you before a one-on-one certain things about the individual. So it's reminding you of not just the transactional nature of the relationship, hey, we've got work that has to get done, but how people like to communicate, how people like to relate. And so the technology can help enable that. It can nudge that. It can also, reward certain behaviors over others. I know that Disco does that. It's encouraging certain types of positive pro-social behaviors. And I think the more that we think about technology as nudging us toward good, the more potential it has for inclusion. There's a lot of opportunity to think about the way that technology can nudge us away from our biases as well. If in the moment of decision, the technology can prompt us to say, hey, do you know that this is where bias plays out and you might be playing into a bias, or giving you that data as you need it to change some of your behaviors.
I think there's a lot of exciting stuff coming, even in the micro interactions of like, I'm about to send a message that says, hey guys, and like, not everybody as a man. So like, could it nudge me to say folks, or, things that might make somebody feel uncomfortable, and they're 3,000 miles away. So I'm not really putting myself in their shoes. The use case you just mentioned around like how people prefer to be represented, how they prefer to communicate, are all things that we want to think more about too, because in platforms like collaboration platforms like Slack, like Microsoft Teams, you mentioned Disco's, it's a lot of like public recognition, but maybe people don't like being publicly recognized. Like maybe they prefer to do that in a one-on-one environment. A lot of exciting tech in the day-to-day. Some interesting stuff on like the hiring side, the recruiting side. One of our customers, Becky Chung, had a question around how is technology helping remove some of that bias on the, like when you're looking for a candidate?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of technologies that are focused on removing bias. So there's Textio, which it changes the language. So it goes through and it looks at your job announcements and it lets you know whether or not you have gendered language, which is more likely if your job announcement has a lot of male words that are thought of as male words, women are less likely to apply. And so Textio will go through the job announcements and change that. And it'll allow you to see the effectiveness of job announcements. There is software, there's Blendor, Brilliant Hire, both of which anonymize the selection or the early part of the selection, so that instead of a resume review, you actually are able to have tasks performed, right, that are like the job, or they're evaluated on answers to questions, but you don't know who it is. You haven't seen the resume, so you don't have school bias, you don't have gender bias, you don't have geographic bias. So certainly at those early stages, there is so a software called Atypica, and Atypica is able to resurface candidates in your own ATS who you might have passed over or who might have applied for one role and are a better fit for other roles. So helping you find more diversity in your own candidate pool. So there are lots of different types of technology that are thinking about the hiring piece, that are thinking about how do we drive for more fairness and more inclusion in the hiring. Blind resume review is one stage. I'm really hopeful for VR, that I think it would be really cool if one day someone had a VR interviewing platform so you didn't know anything about the gender, race, ethnicity of either the interviewer or the person interviewed. You could pick your avatar and it would be something that was totally different. So you really had to focus on what the person said and what their qualities were or what their capabilities were rather than certain, demographic qualities or assumptions.
I don't know. My head kind of went to, have you read Ready Player One or seen that movie?
I read the book, yes.
Yeah, everybody lives in the oasis and you just kind of choose your avatar.
Yeah.
I'm imagining some future state where we're all just wearing VR headsets and working from home and people know me as a fox or a koala bear or whoever I, want to choose as this kind of skin. I don't know if that's a good thing or we would ever get there, but it's kind of a weird sci-fi future to think about.
I like that sci-fi version of work. I think it'd be a lot of fun. And if you think about a lot of the work that we do, we're knowledge workers, so we could have a virtual fox doing the work.
Yeah. What would your avatar be if you?
Oh, an elephant, definitely an elephant. Oh yeah.
One question on I guess the industry and where we're headed. Does it feel like we're hitting a turning point from your perspective in terms of executives are they understand it. They don't need to see the ROI, or is it still kind of not even at SAP, but just more broadly speaking, where do you feel we're at in kind of the journey of, I'm assuming the goal being a 100% inclusive and diverse workforce?
I think we've made progress in the conversation. I think we've made progress in making it a priority and people talking about it and executives being bought on but in terms of the outcomes, we haven't made as much of a difference as we would like. And sometimes we look at things like the pipeline and we say, okay, the pipeline is creating the challenges. But oftentimes we are not getting the diversity out of the pipeline that already exists. And so it's a culture issue that we really have to think about. And you have organizations that really weren't diverse at the beginning. And so some of the cultural practices didn't grow up around inclusion. And I do think that now startup founders are thinking about inclusion early. So I have a lot of optimism that the cultures that are being built now from the bottom up are going to be more inclusive than the ones that we've seen. And it's not, I think, a lack of will. You mentioned that sometimes you're just trying to move fast and get things done. And in the past, when there was no conversation about inclusion, moving fast and getting things done and hiring quickly was just hiring people who were like them and building cultures that really worked for the people that were present in those organizations.
Can you talk about some of the work that you do, I would imagine, earlier in the pipeline, a big push that we want at Disco is we want to find more female engineers. And if you just extrapolate that out, how many people of any, race or gender are going into STEM research or computer science? Do you all have a presence in earlier in the pipeline? And are there initiatives that you're doing to kind of fill that out?
We have a program called Learning for Life, which is for anyone. Right, so it's about expanding the pipeline in a lot of different ways. And so that's open to both earlier in the pipeline, but also people who want to retrain, because I think that that's an opportunity as well. We have a university program that we do outreach. We also have a lot of our CSR strategy is focused on some of that early pipeline development and identifying, girls or other groups, getting them excited about STEM and understanding that some of those folks may never work at SAP, but it's better for all of us if we have more diversity in STEM.
Makes sense. How do you think about you hear a lot about culture fit, right? But really what that's doing is, what's the word? Perpetuating? Is that a word? A lot of the same, right? So how do you think about that at SAP?
So I try to get away from the idea of culture fit And instead I say, look, we want values fit, but we want culture contribution. Because if everyone is the same, then I'm not getting that value of difference. So I need to think about, how do I look for people who I might not feel like, hey, I want to socialize with, but I really think that we could do good work together. And sometimes when you have a group of people with different backgrounds and experiences, the feeling of it can be uncomfortable, can be struggleful, or is that a word? Can be full of struggle. And we need to learn to lean into that and embrace that, because the product is usually better. And if you think about, if you have your wonderful idea and everybody is like, oh, Jeremy, you're so smart, that's so great, that's so great, then the idea doesn't ever get any better. It just stays there. But if you have that same idea and someone's like, well, what about that? What about that? Just think about that. Can we try that? The idea that you have on the other side, it's a better idea. And so we want that contribution from people. We want people that are going to push us to have better ideas. And so I think it's really important for us to get away from culture fit and start thinking about values fit and culture contribution.
Is there a way you all have found it at SAP to kind of flesh out whether it's their background or how they interview, how they would match up against the values or contribute to the culture in a meaningful way?
So we are looking at different technologies to say, how do we know what's the profile, and how do we find that profile in our candidate population? So that's something that we're still looking into. There's a software called Plum, which allows us to create profiles and calibrate both candidates and current employees on those profiles, and that can help with development. But we're not sure what the solution is. I think a lot of it is changing the conversation first, but then again, technology can really help us.
This brings up another dynamic, especially at a company of SAP's size of 95,000 employees, is like you can, I would imagine, get really good at getting a small team on the same page of like, this is how we hire for values and for culture contribution. But finding a way to scale that to all of the hiring managers or all of the managers to kind of think that same way sounds incredibly difficult. Possible with technology and like the right education, but difficult all the same.
Well, it's a challenge, but we are going to have an interview training for our managers.
Yeah.
And so if we make sure that those values are enshrined in our interview training, it might start slow, but it can change, right? You have to think about, what are the channels for information that you use in your organization, and how do you leverage existing channels?
Makes sense. This comes from Becky as well, one of our customers. She was interested in kind of how you talk about diversity to the talent community, and just how you think about broadcasting the good work that you're doing to the candidate pool.
Well, first you have to identify the candidate pool that you want to address. You have to know where they are. You have to know what motivates them. We have a program called our Talent Wins program. And we actually do these large-scale events where we have targeted invitations. So, for example, there was an event recently at Paisley Park, and the goal was getting more women who might be interested in STEM working for SAP. So we had lots of women that we invited, and then we had amazing female singers, and at Paisley Park, to get them excited about SAP. And so we...
Did you do karaoke there?
I wasn't there, so I was not able to go because other responsibilities. But what we're trying to do is just really show that SAP is innovative, that SAP is a company that is thinking about the future, that we are a purpose-driven company, that we are definitely making that outreach, and it's very direct. And I think that's one of our most exciting channels to think about how we are getting our name out to the marketplace, to the talent marketplace.
Yeah, and just from my own personal perspective, so we work with SAP through the SAP IO Foundry program, and we have exposure to how they work with other startups and through like the fund and all of these things, and it's very clear that this is not just a lip service thing. Like they're looking at how diverse the founding teams are and like who they want to work with, and it's a serious topic that people aren't just paying lip service to. So I think that speaks a lot to the work that you're doing and just the culture as a whole. Do you have any closing thoughts or things you want to impart?
I really think that, so when I think about diversity, it's everyone. All of us contribute to the diversity, and inclusion is what powers it. And so I think it's really important to think about, for startups, how everybody, has that space. That's the spirit that I want to convey, is that Bill, who is our CEO, he says diversity is a reality, inclusion is a choice. And I love that quote, because we get to make the choices about the culture that we have, about the teams that we have, about the way that we interact. And that's really more important than anything else.
I think that's an incredible drop the mic. These mics are mounted, but if we could drop them, we would. And the people here would not be happy, but cool. Well, this podcast is a production of Disco. We recorded this episode in the world-class Donatello Studios in San Francisco, California. I want to send a huge thank you to Judith. This has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today about diversity and inclusion, your role at SAP, your background. I learned a lot, and I think our listeners will as well. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, just send me an email to jeremy@justdisco.com. On behalf of Justin, Joseph, myself, and the entire Disco team, thank you so much for listening.